Hello there, and tonight we are going to do Kate Haggis and the Stone Hunters, Chapter 4, Responsibilities. Sorry it's taken so long to get to this one, but I've had a very busy time of it. The last couple of months has been hellacious. So here we go. He inhaled sharply, his watery grey orbs giving a rather distant, contemplative appearance, as though he was delving the very mists of time itself, in order to find the right words before the healer began again. Just after the previous soldiers passed us by, yet again with a small nod of their heads in acknowledgment of him and I being up at such a late hour, quietly conversing by the fireside. Heh, these poor fools! He half smiled wearily. They have no clue how the hunters have sought to get their hands on the stone we gave you. Too long by mine reckoning, too long by any reckoning. Tell me, Kate, did you know that Abavix was the creator of the hunters originally, after first being a member of the Stonekeepers? I shook my head ambiguously. This was all news to me. So you were saying? I urged him on further, no longer able to hold back the ream of questions that was storming my brain. Well, that's for one thing. When you were born, whether you realise it or not, you were already preordained to be a stonekeeper. You were made specifically for that and one other purpose, he explained solidly, as he peered sullenly at me with an expression akin to guilt. What the hell are you saying? I'm just plain old Kate Haggis, born to Caitlin Robin Haggis of Balcaldy in Argyllshire in Scotland. I have two brothers, one older, one younger than me. I'm nothing more than a sub-existing poor ruddy writer, Robert. This is th- there's nothing special about me, and I certainly refuse to believe this bullshit that I was picked out before I was born. It's pure bloody nonsense. Me as a bloody stonekeeper? Can't I just give this one back to wherever it was kept before? Please, Robert. I don't want this responsibility. I did not even want this gift, let alone understand why I was given it originally until now. If it's the reason why I'm jealous and half these so-called hunters are after me, then really I'm damn well not ready for this crap. I cannot be held responsible for looking after this, I protested bitterly, pulling out my hunting dagger and glaring fit to burst at the damn Elstone in the hilt. Full of contempt towards it, it winked coldly back at me, glinting a little in the firelight. I frowned. It didn't seem like this tiny thing could hold any power whatsoever. Too late for that, my dear lass. I'm sad to report you've had it in your possession for more than a moon cycle, and it served you once very well indeed, I might add. It has already become a part of you. As for Angelus, well, he's after your stone because your stone, the stone you bear, could only be carried by an outsider who's female. He was there originally when the plans were made to find a suitable bearer, and when the scroll was handed over to. Uh, anyway, he mocked us just before he was corrupted by Abavix's second in command, who had taken over and begun to rally support from those who ruled the hunters. So I'm afraid taking the stone back's quite out of the question. It's where it's meant to be and seems to be quite content at that. It's you I'm more worried about. Angelus was a great weaver of enchantments when he was truly of living, and now he is more a wraith than anything else. A charming one, it is true, but nonetheless the boy is definitely cursed. He can neither be living the real nor the residual existence to life. Instead, he has to live as though split in two pieces at the same time, fighting to occupy that same time and space of the same continuum. Whereas your stone could put an end to that form of torment for him. But first, in order to corrupt a stone to your will instead of living with it in harmony as you're supposed to, Angelus must first corrupt the heart who wields it. In other words, Kate, I truly believe that Angelus the Earth knows which stone you hold. How he knows I cannot say, but nonetheless he does, and he's after you to get to it. Do you understand what I'm saying now? You see, what makes this worse is every stone hunter there is, and trust me, they are a plenty, is well versed in how Angelus has vowed he would find the life memory stone first. So now it's a good bet that because this Meglin witch saw him in the ballroom with you, she has clicked onto who is the possessor of that stone. Which, of course, is you. That means she'll be sending out every other stone hunter after your arse, and probably Leafledor's too, because he's so deeply and spiritually, supposedly connected with you. Do you understand my concerns now, lass? Uh, I think so. Only one thing puzzles me, though, I replied hesitantly as I thought about this. And that is Kate, he asked, arching a brow at me with honesty, etched across those weather-tanned features of his scar looking like a dark, jagged, shadowy, broken line down his face. How did the stone keepers, as you call them, decide I was the right person to receive the stone that I have in the first place? I mean, how could they possibly have known before I was born? Came my tremulous inquiry in high-pitched tones. But before I could receive an answer, a light hand weighed heavily and gently on my shoulder at the same time, and a soft whisper entered into my ear. It was the voice of Leofudor. Deep and velvety as the night skies, he said so gently, "Oh, what are you two talking about, I wonder?" Kate, I was going to ask you to come with me. I've been busy setting something up that I want to show you. It's really a special surprise. A way of saying I'm sorry, if you like, and also of welcoming you back to the rest of us who awaited your safe return. Uh, Say you'll come with me for a moment. You may as well keep my lass. I've done as much to repair the heat burn as I can. Go have some fun, lass. You're dismissed, smiled the healer in a fatherly kind of fashion. One of these days, I thought quietly to myself, I was going to ask him about his attitude towards me. I rose up hesitantly and watched as Leofudor had already begun to walk back towards the edge of the glade. He had picked up something on his way, covering it with a cloak. It was large and bulky. Being assured the magic user was out of earshot, I raised a querulous brow towards the healer and stated sharply in very low growl, "This conversation is by far from over, Robert. There will be questions at some point, so do not get too comfortable in thinking you have resolved anything." He gave a small cackle as he replied, "Oh, I never assume anything's resolved, lassie, till it's proven." "Cocky little git, isn't he?" snarled my inner voice quietly in a growl, whilst I scowled at him briefly before quickly walking to catch up with the almost pale albino lord, who was now standing at the edge of the clearing by the tree line, still awaiting me. His free hand outstretched to take mine, I gladly took his arm, not feeling overly comfortable with holding his hand, and we wove our way into the shadows of the thick trunks and trees, him moving with that sickening grace of agility and silence. Me, crunching a little on the ground, though having said this, not as much as I perhaps used to, which led me to the conclusion that it probably took a lot of practice to become as stealthy as an elf of this realm, because the elves were so perfect at it. So, what were you and Robert talking about? He inquired casually enough, in a low resonance of his voice, as he glanced at me from the side and halted to help me over a fallen branch. "Oh, nothing. You know Rob, always giving me a lecture for being so careless," I replied, without a second thought about lying to him. I was unsure if I could tell him about the stone keepers or the stone hunters, as the healer had referred to them all as. My own suspicions were still ruminating in my brain about that whole thing. We stepped past a third line of trees, and I could hear the rushing falls of the water from the pool where we had swum earlier in the day, but there was no sign of it. We seemed to be going in a slightly different direction, which involved climbing up steep rocks and past slightly younger trees. It was really quite the effort, and I had to concentrate. Finally, I saw the top of which it was sheltered under an arch of a thicker copse of wild sentinel trees. The sound here was very loud from the water, and I felt confused. But we had reached a large opening in the rock's narrow fissure, where water bubbled up, warm and steamy into the night air. Here mineral deposits were casing some of the mouth opening to it, where it flowed straight past us and then down, over the edge of that rocky outcrop and into the pool far below. He had taken us both to the top of the rocks above the waterfall. As he had said, he had indeed been busy. He had set out what appeared to be a thin two-roped elven version of a bridge in which to cross over the other side, between two of the largest trees and some rocks. Had strung small, tiny candle lanterns at intervals of 2 to 3 feet. The bridge itself was larger than where the water narrowed, to pound and pour in a rushing cascade over the ledge. For here, where the hot natural spring rose from the ground, this upper pool was far wider, at least twice the amount and size of the lower pool, though probably a lot more shallower was my guess. I shall go over first, and I promise to be right back. Wait here, all right? He instructed with a huge grin on his face. I could not help but wonder what he was up to now, for the bridge went well into the trees on the far side and did not descend, it seemed, at all. All right, but do not be too long, Leifildur. I glanced about the narrow ledge he had left me standing upon as he nimbly crossed the rope, like it was nothing more than a walking curbstone back home at the side of a busy main road. He disappeared into the trees on the other side for a few minutes, whilst I gazed about my surroundings. The rope bridge itself did not look so newly constructed as I would first deemed it was. For on closer inspection it revealed old black iron rings set into the rock faces at intervals. This puzzled me. Why had I not noticed it when I had been in the pool so far down below? Had the mist hidden it from my line of sight, perhaps? I wondered who had originally constructed it. The lanterns, however, were new. Tiny things no bigger than 3 inches in diameter and an inch in height. Their small, almost tea-light shaped light orbs burning in a strange flickering of warm, sultry orange glow. Leifildur reappeared and crossed the bridge even quicker the second time. It must have been a lot easier now, seeing as he was carrying nothing extra. He took my hand. Come, Kate, let me show you the surprise. He smiled gently. I'm kind of very uncomfortable with this kind of rope bridge, Leafy. And I certainly am not that fond of heights, dear heart, I said, my brogue thicker than ever. Oh, it'll be easy. Here, take my hand. Just don't look down and follow me. I promise you'll make it. He smiled and reached for me again as I instinctively tried to back away. He snatched my hand and held it tight, pulling me forward. I quickly grabbed at the rope, which was above the second and nearly to the height of my shoulder. Damn it all! I was so short in comparison to his people. Leifildur, I really am not sure about this, I muttered as my feet edged along the bottom rope, and it wobbled. But he merely smiled and coaxed me further. The bloody smug git was walking backwards on the rope, not holding on to anything, as if it was nothing. Balanced perfectly, whereas I was swinging a little and struggling, really struggling to hold my position on the rope as I moved painstakingly forward. Eventually, after several minutes, we had reached the center point. Below us, the gorge which the pool was set in was wide and opened, a deep scar on the landscape despite the moonlight and the stars that shone down. I gulped. That was a lot further down than the pool was. I froze, trembling, but his insistent tugging made me move forward reluctantly. Oh, my head swam. Heights truly was not my thing at all. What seemed like a lifetime is how long it took for us to reach the other side, and then we were there, safely among the sentinel trees once again. It is my belief, and consequently knowledge, that the majority of the trees here in Snowfell were by far a lot older than the majority of trees back on my home world, hence the immensity of their boughs and trunks. You could place a 2-story house in some of these old buggers. Anyway, we reached the other side and now wound along some thick branches towards the center point. Up ahead was a glittering cascade of lights, dancing among the trees' foliage. Here he had laid down the enchantment of the trees. I remember I'd asked Leifildur at some point a few years previously, when I was still in spirit form, how the sentinel trees worked. He had told me that the only certain types of elves were able to request them to change their form, so that housing and the lights could be formed from them. That usually it was a lengthy process, depending on what shape and form of structure was to be created. Here, however, it was simplistic. A large, wide, square base had been woven like a wicker basket floor, only thicker and levelled enough to walk upon. A large seat was risen at one end, which was where a bough had risen in a flat rectangular loop, up through the flooring of the weave. Tiny glowworms were hanging at various intervals and lengths on minute silken threads, glistening as beautifully as stars. There was also a soft murmur of the breeze rustling in the leaves above the canopy opened up, and stars filtered through. I gasped. It was truly amazing. You you've been spending all your time creating this? This is what you've been doing for the last few hours? I asked, aghast with how eclectic, yet wonderfully fantastic this whole little area appeared. Also laying near the seat was another raised section of bough, where he had placed whatever it was he'd been carrying previously on top of. Do you like it? Half the trick is developing on something which already has the potential. Some of the formations in the boughs here were already in place. Just need a little extra guiding and cajoling to finish it as you see it now. He was obviously pleased with his own handiwork. It's absolutely awesome, I answered breathlessly, as I viewed it in all complete awe. Just how long did this take? And what kind of energy and expenditure this must have cost you? I said, waving an arm around in the glory of his handiwork. He smiled, and taking my hand ever so gently, led me over to where he had spread out his thick fur-lined travelling cloak on the largest flat piece of the bough, where the small bag of food and wine was already laid down. Ah, so that's what he'd been up to. He'd been setting up a picnic for us to share in secret. Way up here in the peaceful end of the world, so far away from the troubles below. I'd never thought of Leaford as being a romantic before. He'd always been so serious, so grim. Always the dark, deep, horrible thinker in the group. Far from the emotional, expressive person that, say, perhaps, Morrissey was. In fact, he'd been the complete opposite. Sure, we'd had our quiet, tender moments, but this completely just blew me away, making me see him in a whole new, different light. My mouth was open. I was unable to say anything to this other side of him. So we sat down and ate a high meal of bread, cheese, and cold sliced meats, drank a little wine, and when it was time, Leafwood muttered a few softly spoken power words, and with a shimmering glimmer of his left hand as he waved it in a genteel arc across the canopy of the leaves, the tiny little glowworms cut off their light. He invited me to lay a while on his outspread cloak, and just gaze up at the stars with him in silence. We had talked a little before sleepiness finally overcame me, and before I knew it, whilst gazing at those blue twinkling diamonds of the night sky, I fell into a slumber. I awoke. It was considerably colder than it had been. Leafwood was at first nowhere to be seen, and I panicked, because I did not immediately recognize my surroundings. I rose to sitting position, then saw him standing casually, leaning against a bough, gazing still up at the stars, his head tilted to one side. Golden white shoulder-length hair glowing a soft white iridescence, a ghostly pale shade along with the rest of him. I dared not speak. He turned around to face me and gave me a soft, wan, and weary smile, and I frowned in response. He had been obviously deep in thought, obliviously, until he had become aware of me staring at him. I lowered my gaze momentarily as he slipped towards me stealthily with his unearthly silent grace, as per usual. Crouching by my side, he whispered, "You've been sleeping for a couple of hours, Kate. Perhaps we should head back to the rest of the encampment." Before he reached over for the bag which he had held our picnic, it had already been packed before I'd had a chance to awaken, it seemed. Stiffly I rose, and rolling my neck and stretching to get the kinks out of my poor mortal frame. He had already nimbly picked up his cloak and wrapped it about his own form, then took my hand once more to lead me across and through the trees. Yet again we were definitely heading a different direction than previously. because instead of crossing the bridge, we were lowered to the ground by using various branches and boughs that acted almost like a stairway. It brought us less than a couple of yards short of the beautiful sandy shoreline that lay on the opposite side to the pool from where the camp was. We held hands and quietly stepped through the woodland around the pool, the mist of which wreathed the ground in silvery vapours of sweet-smelling, fresh, watery scent that was a delight. Upon reaching the camp, Robert, I was surprised to see, still sitting up and waiting for us both. He gave a lopsided grin with a teasing remark of, "Enjoy yourselves, did you? Had fun, did we, laddie?" He smirked, eyeing up Leofudor suspiciously, then added, "I hope you didn't dishonour anyone." "We had a picnic, nothing more. Unfortunately, my poor lady fair here was so exhausted that she somewhat fell asleep just soon after the meal," snorted the lord, not realizing he was being goaded. He gave Robert a rather disdainful stare, as though he was mortally insulted. "Right, a picnic it takes almost half the night," nodded the healer, with an even sillier grin. "Actually, Robert, it was so cool. We also watched the stars for a little bit. It was so nice to feel so peaceful with the world. Perhaps you should try it once in a while, then maybe you would not be such a ruddy grumblepot," retorted Leofudor hotly. And yes, I messed up that voice, but don't worry about it, people. Haughtily, as he then said quietly to me, "Come on, Kane, I shall escort you to your shared tent. You really ought to get some rest. Tomorrow we have quite a ways to go before we set up another camp again." But, but, I thought it had been agreed that we'd stay here a couple of days," I protested. "Change of plans," he said, his face stern, but he would not speak further upon it, kissed my forehead at the tent flap before I departed inside, and took off again. How infuriating was that, I wondered silently to myself. Typical. It takes you on a romantic evening and you're too damn tired to make more of it because you fell asleep like an idiot. And now they get scheming again with it, including you in the plans. Bloody freaking typical of his egotistical lordship, rang my inner voice loudly. I slipped out of my travelling gear and into a pale white linen shift that had been kindly set out for me by an empty makeshift cot. I lay down sighing and staring up at the roof of the tent, my mind a whirlwind of various assorted things, which just did not make any sense. Broad daylight, and I was awoken. My head hurt, and I still ached all over. It was not the sunshine that had made me open my eyes, though. It was the sound of Joanne and another maiden who shared the tent with us, coughing severely and throwing up nearby. Lovely. Sympathetic gagging caused me to rise up and quickly tend to the pair. Both of them looked like death warmed up. Joanne was more than definitely running a fever. Her son Colwyn, who was crying loudly by her side, was red in the face when I promised to take him out. I lifted him up tenderly, never having had much dealings with babies, changing his cloth diaper first, then his clothes after giving him some warmed goat's milk with oatmeal mixed in it. The child smiled at me and gurgled as I rocked him and made him burp a couple of times, now leaving the tent. Inwardly, my thoughts echoed loudly of, "Do not get too comfy, kid. I'm going to give you straight to your daddy, believe me. Then I'm going back in there to see to your silly mother." But obviously I did not say this out loud as I cooed at the child in my arms, rather displeased that I had been put on nursing detail. Sagerson came to greet me with that subtle arch brown question about the child in my arms. I gave a short non-committal shrug before saying, "Don't ask. Joanne and one of the ladies in waiting are very sick in there. No doubt the other and I will catch it before the day is out, if we stayed in there too. Have you seen Morrissey? I have fed his son and changed him. Time for him to take over, because I've not a single maternal instinct in my body right now. Too much going on in my brain, not enough sleep during the night," I grumbled as I stared hard at him. "Actually, no. As for the ladies in our camp who are sick, I shall make sure either Master Trelawney or one of my healers sees them, post haste. I was going to ask you if you had seen my cousin, actually. I've not seen him since early yesterday eve, afore twilight," he answered in that same disdainful and disquieted tones as he always used with one subject below him. "Oh, well, Leofudor's fine. He was with me for most of the evening, and we talked. As for where he is now, I have no clue. Perhaps you should ask Robert. Maybe he would know." But upon checking out the encampment, I could see neither the Manningreen's, the ranger, nor Maury's lifelong friend, the mage. Strange, there was also 2 soldiers missing too. How curious that none of them were available. I wonder where they'd gone to. It was not like the boys to just take off all at a time like this. I sighed and announced I was going to bathe and perhaps even change into fresh clothes. I grinned as I picked up some clothes, juggling the baby in one arm, which was not so hard because he was, after all, so still tiny at this point. I talked in soft words to Colwyn as I made my way through the weave of trees, found myself at the pool shoreline once again. Carefully with one hand, I dexterously untied my cloak, laid it down carefully on the ground, and put the baby on it. He was kicking and gurgling happily at me. I frowned. What was I thinking, bringing him along with me? Then again, what choice did I have? For his mother had placed him in my charge, and she was seriously ill with something or another. I got out of my clothes, glancing about nervously to make sure no one was watching. Having spotted not a single other soul save for Colwyn and myself, I giggled and took off my skivvies before unwrapping the tiny babe before me down to nothing and walked towards the edge of the water. Okay, my little buddy, time for you to have your first meal. Well, first real bath in a warm pool and learn to swim. Your mother can swim and your dad cannot, so seems there'll be neither of those teaching you any time soon, due to their differences. I'm going to be your coach. We'll go in gently, softly, carefully, so you can get used to the temperature. I've a coat big enough and close enough to dry the pair of us, so no worries there, all right? Good. Just don't piss on me, please. And no nasties in the pool, I said, and walked further into the water, clutching him close to my chest. His head on my shoulder as we made our way into the water till it was waist deep. Here I sat down till the water covered my chest. Slowly, with a kind, firm hand holding onto the ranger's son with my free one, I lapped the water up and over him. He gave a small squeal of delight. Holding onto the ledge below me with one hand, I turned in the water carefully, holding the head above it, but allowing him to float at all the same time, and slid off the ledge. Treading water was easy for me with just my legs. I pulled the child close to my chest. As I turned onto my back and nestled him onto this onto that area, holding him still with that one hand. Coleman was big enough these days that he could hold his own head up with his little fat podgy arms under him. He lay now like that on my chest and stomach, and gurgled his approval as I swam out towards the middle, and maintained a relatively easy floating position, head raised, smiling at him as he stared wide-eyed back at me, his orbs glittering an unusual golden hazel brown. His eyes were like his mother's. His black curls were now plastered to his head and reminded me of Morrissey, after getting soaked in the rain, perhaps. His skin was as pale as his dad's, too. I smiled, my heart warming to him as we played in the water, carefully supporting him with both my hands, holding him firm but gently under the arms. I trod water and let him float outwards before pulling him back in. I knew that Colwyn could not understand a word I was saying as yet, but I still instructed him to kick his legs to swim. We were nearly at the opposite side of the shore, and my bottom touched down on the other ledge of rock. I sat there playing with Colwyn, my shoulders and the tops of my breasts exposed to that cool bite of the summer breeze from the water, for the water was a lot warmer. I then swam back with him to the side we had first entered and pulled free a small bar of sandalwood soap that had poppy seed grains in it from out of my small bag, and began to wash him gently, finally wrapping him up tightly in my cloak as he began to get sleepy. I rocked him in my arms for a little while longer. When he was asleep, I dressed the child carefully so as not to disturb his little angelic being from his slumbers, including giving him a fresh diaper again. Then once more wrapped him tenderly in a small blanket using a kite formation so he could not move should he awake, thoughtfully finding some rather large base stones and surrounding him even further for protection. Then I quickly slipped back into the water on the ledge. I stood and soaped myself down, feeling the grime slow off me. But in actual fact there was nothing that dirty about me. I was already fairly clean. Then I lay in the warm sunshine on my cloak, holding little Colwyn close and barely dressed at all, only my vest and bloomers on, and I fell asleep in that haze too. My, oh my, are we not the good quiet aunt today? Oh, Are we not, Kate? Came the mocking laughter of a very familiar voice of Morrissey, followed by some more cackling from behind him. Damn, Morty, you near enough gave me a heart attack, I declared, sitting dead bolt upright in the intrusion, clutching a still napping child in my arms. For the ranger was not alone. There stood Leafador close by his side, and Robert. The latter two were carrying the large doe between them, rested on a pole. They were both laughing at my discomfiture to this situation. I scowled at both of them as I stared, and stated rather defensively, Joanne was sick, all right, so I decided Colwyn and I should go take a bath and rest a while. Now, if you three do not mind, I need to get the rest of my clothes on, please. I lifted Colwyn up to his father, who stood beaming at his son proudly. Hurriedly, I scrambled into my clothes whilst the other three took off with the child and their carried load. Hearing Leafador shout behind him, See you back at the camp, Kate. But I was sure I heard him snickering at that, and a few other chuckles from the other two. Grumbling, I pulled out my small riding shoes. Today, undoubtedly, the way Sagerson had been earlier, we would be moving soon enough. Lastly, I trudged wearily through the thick trunks of tree line, and back into that glade clearing. All seemed as it always did. The deer which had been caught was now busy being carved up by two of the more burlier folk who occupied a position with these travelling companions. The other three were by the fireside making undoubtedly a pot of tea or similar. Colwyn was now awake, and his father had him out on the tightly wrapped blanket, and was allowing him to attempt to crawl around, keeping a very careful watch over him. Whereas every now and then he would pick up the child or redirect him to ensure he stayed on the large, thick cloak which was laid out for him to play on. He'd even given him some carefully carved wooden toys. Huh. Since when had Morrissey taken to carving? I mused silently, with that small smile flickering on my lips and eyes as I watched the scene before me. Robert glanced up and gave me a large wave, calling me over. Come on, Kate, I think you could probably do with a wee cup of tea, right? Out of my peripheral vision, I caught sight of Sagerson and two of his knights marching across from his personal tent, heading straight for the three by the fireside. He looked mightily pissed. Cringing, I made my way with a subtle spring to my step, the waters of the pool having invigorated me, to say the least. I smiled casually as I strolled over and sat down next to little Colwyn on the large, outspread garment. He crawled right towards me after dropping what he had been doing, just as Robert handed me a cup of tea with some honey on it. Sagerson made it to our small group, and with an imperialistic air about his person, announcing, Ah, I see you went hunting. And how's your swim, Lady Kate? But he did not even allow me time to answer. I was half opening my gob to say how wonderful it had been, when he stared hard at the magic user and announced, Cousin, we have much need, very much need, to talk. It's plainly clear that staying here is not the best idea in the world, and as you so adequately stated, we can but stay no more than a couple of days at the most. My question is this: where do we go to and head next? I need to know so that preparations for the journey can be made. He gave the rest of us this rather arrogant, ignorant, snooty look. Snob, I thought. I have given this a great deal of thought, Sagerson, and it would seem that both Kate and Robert were correct the first time this subject came up in passing. So it is therefore I shall be dividing our party up into two parts. One to Snowfell itself, in order to make sure you can keep your potential throneship, and the other to Nairn. I myself will personally accompany you to Snowfell, if you please, but Morrissey, Joanne, and Robert are at the very least are agreed to go to Nairn. As for young Lady Kate here, I have no clue as to her intentions. Before he smiled down at me and said softly, So, Kate, where will you choose to go? I'll not force your hand upon this matter, I promise. I wanted, in truth, to go with Leafador, but I knew it would only bring further strife. I sighed deeply as I bit my lip thinking about this, frowning in contemplation. I turned my head down to face little Colwyn. Ah, damn it. There was a connection there that I dared not admit to. Finally, with pursed lips, I explained hesitantly. All right. Well, I was going to come with you, Leifildur? Robert made a sudden expression of protest, but he held his tongue as I gave him a reprimanding glance and continued with the explanation of, but whilst Joanne is sick and needing someone other than just Morrissey to help her out with the baby, I think it'd be wise if I go to Nairn. Besides, Nairn apparently holds some answers to questions I need solutions to. Sorry, Leafy, but I'll not be going with you this time. I'm going with Robert, where it'll probably be safer. Besides, if these stone hunters are really looking for me or to take me out, then you do not want me traveling with you and His Royal Highness here in case they try something. Like I always say, better to lead them away than lead them to. I smiled firmly. The man in green sighed with relief and muttered something under his breath to that effect, which I do not believe anyone picked up on. I thought you told me you did not have a single maternal bone in your body, Kate, reprimanded Sagerson, obviously not happy with my decision, as he stared down at me and I picked up Colwyn rather protectively into my arms. Catching a quick glance at Morrissey and nodding towards the child's suckling bottle that he was already being warmed and prepared for him. He handed it over and I tested a droplet or two on my inner wrist. Perfect. I leaned the baby back and let him take the bottle, but my eyes raised to the prince, who stood as a dark, sinister shadow over me. I stated clearly for all to hear as my orbs narrowed pensively. Aye, that I did, but let me tell you this. You don't have to have a maternal instincts to keep a careful watch over a baby. Plus, he's an innocent and needs to be taken well care of. And I am, after all, his adopted auntie, which makes me just as responsible for his upbringing than his own parents to an extent. It's my duty as much as anything else to help where I can. I glanced back down at Colwyn, who was holding his bottle. The prince humphed loudly, spun on his heel, giving a brief signal to his knights, and left. Robert clapped me hard on my still bad shoulder and said, heartily relieved, You go, lass! You do realize that he may not wish me to go with him to Snowfell. That being the case, then I'll be coming to Nairn anyway, Kate. So you don't have to feel so torn up about your decision to help my best friend and his family, smiled Leifador. But the worry and concern in his dark orbs were clear enough to detect and see. I shall go converse with mine cousin a little longer. And with that he moved away from all of us and began to stride with his long legs after the prince. The following day Joanne and the first maiden were more ill and sicker than ever before. The secondary lady in waiting, too, was now coming down with the same affliction. I was glad that Leifador had not chosen to go with his cousin, though there had been quite a few who did. Also, his cousin opted to take on the two maidens with his group into the citadel and housing for healing purposes. For a few days we rode hard, despite the fact we had to pick up a small cart on the way to transport Joanne in. This act in itself slowed our travelling capabilities down considerably due to the weather and the pathways not being the best kept. Joanne, who was now looking deathly ill and barely able to feed herself, let alone take a sip of water without choking on it. Robert and I were beside ourselves. When I was not riding my own mare, I kept careful vigilance over her, telling her all about how well her son was doing when she was conscious. For indeed I took it in turns with Morrissey to carry the papoose of Colwyn, as I had promised, and generally helped out in all areas of his care and well-being. 4 days' travel, and we arrived in the village where Abavix had been on destruction mode. The shell of the village once known as Benbrook. We camped there this particular night with no fear or worries at all. I sat beside Joanne, who had been laid near the roaring fire, her face pale and glittering with perspiration, her cheeks flushed red and hot. I was near to tears at this point, though the healer had told me to stay strong for her. Even Morrissey was beginning to feel the strain. Joanne had never been a person I'd got on with at the best of times, nor someone I would particularly place upon the top of my buddies list. But she was the only other person who had lived and breathed from my home world. The only other person whom I knew would understand the jokes, the phrases, which I had come to learn firsthand. I did not want her to die, though for all the administering she received, we could not find any cure to this malady she was suffering from. Colwyn was fast asleep in my arms, having had 2 bottles, a small bowl of cereal pounded down and mixed with warm, fresh milk, and changed again. Its little angelic face so peaceful and unaware of what was going on. Strangely, he had not cried overly much for his mother, but had seemed quite content to be nursed between his father and I. A conundrum that had quite perturbed me as well as cost me a lot of teasing from the rest of the group. For with us had come 2 of the valets of the Dordinger household and 3 of the soldiers, as well as 1 of the knights. Even now, as the evening set upon us, dull and cloudy skies, making it darker than the dusk had been for a while, bringing the threat of rain, which I could smell, duly watching the sparks of heat lightning in the distance, while the scouts and watch for the night had been arranged, I sat there, mopping her brow and nursing the small child close to my chest, startled out of my thoughts by a firm, strong hand on my shoulder, and Robert's voice saying quietly in the hush of the crackling firelight, "Matter nothing, Kate. Does not seem she'll wake up any time soon. She's still run that fever, lass." Yes, she's still running an awful fever, Rob. There has to be something to break it, surely. I somehow think this is terminal. But not a single potion or magical essence concoction in all the realms can heal her from this illness, lass. I've tried everything known. Even the prince's personal priest and parents tried before they left, and nothing was resolved. What puzzles me is how you've managed to stay healthy through all this. After all, every lady in our first camp came down with this plague. Which troubles me more is that our male folk here seem not susceptible to it either. Which makes me draw the conclusion that whatever it was not natural, that's for sure. He replied sourly, as he sat down beside me and carefully took the damp, sweet, herb-smelling cloth from my left hand and dipped it in the solution held in the small wooden bowl, to begin to mop her face and neckline again. I must admit, in all the years I've ever lived, Kate, my lass, I've never seen something so vicious before. Did you check the sores she's been developing? Uh-huh, and they look worse than ever. I've even cleaned them with salt and rosemary water, but the smell's nasty. Rank odor seeping with the pus. And they appear to be eating away at her very flesh, Rob. God, how I wish I could do something for her. She has not opened her eyes all day, and I know that does not bode well, I replied mournfully, staring at her face. Well, go get yourself some rest, lass, and hand the wee one over to Maury. I believe he needs the sun right now. It will help soften the blow when she passes, because in all truth I do not think Joanne's going to make it this time. Not through the end of this night. He sighed heavily as I rose up, tears burning in his orbs as much as mine own. Gulping down the large lump in my throat, I quavered as I asked, Have ha, have you told him yet? Another deep sigh resonated from his pursed lips as he tentatively tended the woman laying on that small bed before us. I nodded to this response. He had not told the young ranger yet. I searched out Morrissey and found him easily. He was brushing down the horse's flanks by the cart. He was busy humming a small tune to himself that I did not even recognize. I cleared my throat. Um, Maury? Here, take Colwyn a while, please, and go see Robert. He's something to tell you, I offered gently, one hand lightly placed in reverence upon his own upper arm that had been firmly stroking the brush down the horse's mane and stopping his action immediately. He glanced up at me, his sparkling blue sky orbs having lost some of their usual luster, gave me a brief, understanding nod, and put the brush down carefully by his kit bag, before lifting his son gently to him and moving away towards Robert. Morrissey was torn with grief and would not let his son be parted from his side, for later that night Joanne drew some of her very last final breaths. Leoford used his magic on her, placing Joanne in suspended animation, placing her in a cave on the side of the very same mountain with the cairns of rock placed over as the opening site. For until a cure could be founded, she would remain safely here as though dead, all of us solemn and feeling the loss, none more so than that of our young ranger, who could not be consoled nor persuaded to leave the mound side. We stayed camped a little longer than expected. I watched from the fireside. I felt sorry for Colin more than anything else. He had only just turned 2 years old a couple of weeks previously, and now would be raised without a mother figure who doted on him. My heart was torn in grief. There was nothing more I could do. Marshy stood there for hours crying and not understanding, hating, blaming the world, the divine, everything and everyone, including himself. The wound to his heart plain to tell and see. And it was eventide when Leafwood stood out there with Marshy, talking in quiet, reassuring notes, I am assuming, as Robert and I sat by the fireside watching pathetically. Finally Sir Kelvin broke down in completeness, and Leafwood hugged him close. Little Colwyn was crying too at this point, trying to remove that guilty feeling of being so useless towards his wife's demise. I began to get some of the milk we had in powder and mix it with water and oatmeal, preparing a bottle and meal for his son, mixing some of the leftover mashed potatoes, combined with a little of the meat gravy and carrots. His son had to stay healthy for his father's sanity's sake, and so far I had at least achieved that much. So it was, therefore, that the death mask I had seen over Joanne that one night so far back had finally proven to be true. She had suffered greatly enough, and her mark had been imbued upon all our hearts. We did not leave Benbrook till the following morning, though, when we took the old road to Nairn, which crosses the trade route to Falach. Silence is an awful thing sometimes, just as much as it can be a blessing. It's one of those two-edged blade things. You get used to telling which way it may go. Colwyn had been placing his papoose and strapped to his father's back. Every turn that I had offered to take, Marshy snapped bluntly, angrily at me for wanting to help him. I decided at that moment that there was nothing I could do other than let him abate his frustration first. He would ask of me soon enough if he had need of my aid. We rode now in silence, as I had already aforementioned, but it was painful. Every now and then I heard what sounded like sobbing coming from behind me. I knew it was the dark-haired ranger, but dared not look back. We reached the crossroads and turned up the same winding track that less than a year previously I had taken afore I had run into the rangers of the north and their cohort. This time there was no sign of them. The journey was hard-pressed going up through the narrow valleys steadily. A few more days on the road, and the path before us split into another branch. This new pathway, which was very worn, was the one we would take. The other, which was more overgrown and sparser to say the least, led into the foothills of Nice's Cairn, to eventually come to the haunted, run-down little old abandoned town, where vampires and evil entities ruled at night. Shuddering, we gracefully began our slight descent into the foothills that wound up the other way, and headed further into the north. Here the spring had come, but it was noticeably a lot cooler than down south. Colwyn was now sneezing and coughing, causing me to panic and pray he did not have the same infection which had taken his beloved mother. It was late on the third day up in these same hills we heard the sounds of wolves, not uncommon for this area, and fortifications, of course, were taken as burning smaller fires in a circle about our camp. Although wolves in this area had never attacked people in general, there was always that first time. Plus Marshy, at this point, was at his wits' end with his son. He was in the middle of changing one of the child's cloth diapers, and his son was kicking and screaming at the top of his lungs in protest. He growled something at Colwyn. I snapped this time. It was time for the Proud to back down and I to intervene, because enough was enough. He could not possibly blame his son for being the reason his wife had died. Nor should he have been losing his patience with the child. I stormed over to him. Eyes were upon me, but I cared not. I tapped him on the shoulder just as the baby gave out another howl of protest. Marshy glanced up and hotly asked with a noise, "What?" To which the reply I gave him cut any further recriminatory words from his mouth as I gave him a very hard punch to the face and said crossly, "Do not treat your son like that, Maury. I ever catch you talking to your son with that amount of displeasure in your voice again, and I will do more than slap the skin off your ruddy jaw. He's a baby, a small child, and deserves to be treated with love. Stop blaming everyone yourself for what happened to Joanne. Heavens knows we all knew how much you bloody well loved her." I snatched up little Colwyn, who instantly halted crying as I nursed him to my chest angrily, staring hard down at the Ranger before adding in that dark, hushed hiss of contempt, "How dare you blame your innocent son? How dare you get pissed with him? Morrissey Kelly, you should be thoroughly ashamed of yourself. Try to think about how your son's going to be feeling, being raised with no mother, you bastard." I took to cradling Colwyn protectively still, and said in a soft, warm voice to him, "Here, little one, what are you so gnarly about today, huh? You gonna let little Annie Kate take a wee look at you? All right, sweetie, there, it's okay. Daddy was just having a very bad day, that's all." Before I stared down at the Ranger and demanded nicely, "Give me his diaper. I'll clean him and put it on him. The poor little bugger has a chest cold and is sick. Plus a wet rash on his bottom. No wonder he doesn't want to be in his diaper. You should have noticed that much at least." I slapped the diaper out of his offering hand. His orbs were filled with tears as he hung his head in shame. I sat down by his side and cleaned up his offspring with tender care, then glanced over to Robert. But there'd been no need. It was as if the healer had read my mind. He was already pulling items out of his healer's bag that he carried with him everywhere. Several objects were merely dumped out in handfuls as he searched it thoroughly. "Oh, I have some talc already powdered and some acorn flour. Which would you prefer?" he asked helpfully, grateful that the squealing child was now sounding a little less whiny. Talc mixed with the flour should have enough starch to dry the excess moisture. Hey, do you still have some of that strong mint liniment we used when I had pneumonia in your bag, Robert? "I think so, lass," he replied, cheering a little as he rummaged through the contents to his bag, then produced a small screw-lid tub that held the offending mixture in it. I gratefully took it from his hands after dusting down the child's nether regions with the powdery flakes first, placing a fresh diaper on him. Then dipped a couple of my fingertips into the waxy substance and began to apply it to Colwyn's chest and throat line. Little dab on the tip of his nose to relieve his sniffles, smiling at him softly at the same time. He was just so tiny and so helpless, but I vowed no harm would ever come to him as it had Joanne. I pursed my lips, having settled him now in thicker warm blankets, and placed him in the papoose that had been built, strapping him in firmly before placing him in a position so he was semi-upright and I could feed him. Marshy, meanwhile, had sat there in absolute shock, staring from his son to me and back again more than once. I was really disgusted with the Ranger's lack of consideration towards his son, so when I had finished feeding Cole and he was drifting to sleep, I hoisted him and firmly instructed Maury that I would be taking charge of his son for a while, whether he liked it or not, before storming off with the little one to my own personal tent. I lay there a little while longer, taking Colwyn out of his encasement and placing him close to me as I leaned on my side, arms wrapped about him tenderly, before I pulled the covers over and drifted to sleep myself. There was a clamouring shout that echoed loud and clear in my ears, and awoke me with a start. At first I did not comprehend what was going on, but there was yelling and screaming as well as shouting, the virtual sound of fighting coming from nearby where I had my tent pitched, the resounding thunderous roar of an expelling of immense energy that caused half the side of my tent to be ripped asunder. Afore my eyes, as I recovered from the reeling shockwave that hit, I saw Leofudor casting another fireball and shouting out orders over the chaos. I snatched up little Colwyn, who was now crying with fright, and scrambled to my feet. I had to hide, get the child at least to safety. I ran helter-skelter through the burning camp that was in an uproar. A flash of light swiftly passed me by as I huddled Colwyn to my chest, as if his and I's life depended upon it. Ducking quickly as an arrow came whizzing past my head. We were under attack. and there were several outcrops of rocks here and small ledges along the pathway. I half slid down a slated, pebbled, and broken rock slope till I came to a skittering halt on my backside into a small rising of cliff face. I dashed up and crept behind the rocks, sheltering the little one in my arms, covering his head and being able to do nothing more than watch that fighting from a distance. I could not quite make out the assailants, but they were obviously had a mage with them, for Leafador was engaged in battle, and with each shot he cast towards the cloaked, hooded figure in the darkness, it sent back one as equally well aimed. Colwyn was crying again. I hushed him gently, rocking him, as I remained crouched up and crunched up in our tiny space, rocking him slightly with my body because there was barely any room to move at all. I could hear shouting and bellowing coming from both sides of the participating combatants. Morrissey had been firing arrows up until now into the cohorts that came as a wave like black ants swarming over the hill and down the north road. Now he was fighting with both his bastard swords drawn, swirling and twirling with a graceful speed and fury I had never seen him display before. Robert was similarly engaged, his short sword and poniard taking out whoever got in his way. He had 3 opponents upon him. The soldiers and the one knight who decided to follow us were in a similar predicament. I gulped. I was useless right now. The only thing I could do was protect this child of innocence from being drawn into it mercilessly. I pulled free my hunting knife with the elfstone. What the fuck? Muttered my internal voice as I stared at it in shock. It was glowing fiercely and thrumming, as was too, I noticed, the one on the hilt of the healer's short sword. I did not know what it meant exactly, but judging by everything else, presumed it to be nothing but bad. I also had no time to ponder upon such irregularities. The dawn was rising, but as yet the sunlight had not made it over the eastern hills that abound this area. Crouched in the small recesses away from the camp, I saw the place being overrun. One by one my fellow travellers were taken out and knocked down, till at last all were captive. The only 2 remaining free from our small company was Colwyn and I. Even Leafador fell, and I watched painfully, barely able to halt myself from yelling out a warning as another came behind him to strike a blow across his head, till he fell to the ground. Clamping my hand over my mouth, tears spilling down from my cheeks as I watched the company be gathered and herded and chained. The encampment was then thoroughly searched, and here came the most horrific part. As I sat there with the ranger's son still in my arms, the figures tore through that whole area, searching it. Robert had already thrown his short sword far from him. It had slithered down the same steep embankment that I had come to a halt at the end of, its stones still glimmering with soft green iridescent glow. I crept forward, carefully. As quickly as I could I clambered towards it whilst they were still making noise above me, and searching the upper encampment and grabbed it in my hands. It felt lighter than a feather as I pulled it back into hiding with me, covering the glowing elfstone with a part to my shirt blouse that I wore. I was terrified. Something was called out, though I could not be sure as to what was said. The assailants left, taking my most favoured companions as prisoners with them. It was a good 2 hours later before I even dared to make my appearance, yet again out from hiding. Slowly, as I half slid and slipped over the broken shale and boulders, I managed to climb my way to where our camp now lay in ruins. They had not even left a single horse available. Tears filled my eyes, and I sniffed them back in defiance. It was up to me now to get the child to Nen and Robert's sword to Nathan. He would know what to do, surely. Amongst the ruins I found the papoose, changed the child once again just to be safe, grabbed the healer's old medicine bag along with my satchel and a sword belt. Sorry, Colwyn, but I guess you'll not be dealing with your father for a small bit, lad. Seems like you and I have to go to Nairn alone, I mumbled apologetically. The next chapter will be chapter 5, and it's called Keepers. And thank you all for listening to Kate Haggis and the Stone Hunters by Kat Anders, which I don't know if you can see the book very well, but I would encourage people to buy this book. simply because it's got a lot of ups and downs, lots of sarcasm, and also the money goes to charity. So we're all about a bit of good charity. Thank you all for listening and thinking, wow, she really screwed up on the book quite a few times in there today. Thank you. Have a blessed evening, blessed day, whatever you may be. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.